many podcasts have been starting to add trailers. And their hope is that those trailers show the viewers what to expect and they can retain them for the whole video. But many of them do it horribly. So I spent a bunch of time and I analyzed 7 of the videos from the pioneer in the space, Diary of a CEO. I wanted to really understand why their trailers work and why they hook me in more than anything else. And I came across 4 big patterns that they use editing wise to make sure that their trailers really hook the viewers in and keep them watching until the end. So I'm going to share those with you today. The first thing that they do is they cut off the answer from the guest. They never give you the full answer to what's going on. In a trailer, the last thing that you want is to know what's going to happen next. You never want the trailer to spoil everything, and so Diary of a CEO does this really, really well by making sure they cut off some of the most important bits of a soundbite so that you are constantly asking what are they going to say next, keeping you engaged as the audience member into the whole podcast. Yeah, sure, you can jump around, but you want to know what's going to happen throughout the context behind the quote. And so you're going to stick around for more of the podcast because there's a quote that you don't really know what they're going to say next to, so you're very intrigued to what's going to happen. Second, they do something really masterful. One of the things that you have to be careful of when doing podcast trailers is your audience knowing or not knowing who the guest is. If they don't know who the guest is, then you have a problem. You have a credibility issue. You want to make sure that your guest is understood as somebody that is an expert in their field or that they have a lot of credibility to what they're going to be talking about. And so one of the things that Diary of a CEO does in their trailers is they do what I like to call setup then context. In the first 10 seconds of their trailers, for the most part, they give you a controversial quote and lead that into the context behind who the guest is and why their voice matters in the space. And so if you look at any of their trailers, you'll kind of notice that they set you up with a hook and drive straight into the context of who the guest is. And that's really important for keeping the audience engaged into the podcast, because if they don't know who the guest is or the credibility of the guest, they're going to completely be lost and believe that the guest doesn't actually have the credentials necessary. And so you want to make sure that the credibility of the guest is high so that when you go through the rest of the trailer and the podcast, the audience automatically knows that this is the person that they want to listen to, that they should listen to. And so if you avoid the point where you give credibility to who your guest is, you're missing a really important point for a podcast intro trailer. That setup, then the context of who the guest is. So that way your audience knows why they should listen to them. For the third thing that they do, the third trick that they use, it's something that I see a lot throughout YouTube. It's something that I saw when I started writing about editing a little bit and stuff like that. They tend to cut about every 2.5 to 3 seconds. And when they do cut, they use sound effects, text, and a lot of other things to make sure that the cut kind of gets hidden and you don't notice it. That way you can keep the pace high and keep the audience engaged for longer. Now, there's something that I learned from Hayden Hillier-Smith about pacing, which is if you do a lot of longer cuts into shortcuts, you can extend a cut for a little bit longer. And the Diary of a CEO does do that at times. They do that when there's a very emotional point that they want to get across in the trailer. But it's a really important one to notice. The fact that they cut pretty quickly and pretty often to make sure that the audience is engaged in whatever is going on. They'll cut to the host, they'll cut to the guest, they'll cut in on the guest, use text, use B-roll, anything and everything to hide the cuts and make sure that you don't really notice how fast they're moving through the information they're giving you. Because they only have 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes to give you all of the information you need and be fully hooked into the podcast for like 1.5 hours, 2 hours. So that's one of the main tricks that they use that I noticed was that they cut pretty quickly, about every 2.5 to 3 seconds. Lastly, the thing that they do that really sets the tone for the whole podcast is the end of the trailer. They don't just end it abruptly. They use a cut to black with a very specific moment to set the tone for the rest of the trailer. So there's sometimes where they'll cut to black on a very emotional moment, something where the guest is crying or very emotional, and they use a specific kind of music score to make sure that emotion gets across when they cut to black, allowing the audience to feel that emotion as the podcast starts on a different tone. It gives the audience a sense for the tone that they're going to be experiencing throughout the podcast. On other times, they'll cut on a higher note and use that as something for what the podcast is going to be about, the tone for the podcast. The cut to black really serves as a point for the audience to breathe before getting into the full podcast. And it serves as a way to set the tone. So if you're not doing that, to a cut to black or something where you let the audience breathe after giving them so much information, then you're really missing an important aspect of those podcast intros. Like My First Million does it with an intro video, like intro after the fact. So they'll do their little coming soon clips and they'll cut into their intro, and that gives you a little bit of a breath before getting into the full podcast. So those are just 4 things that the Diary of a CEO does in their podcast trailers that really make them stand above all the rest. And there's so much more because they put so much work into those podcast trailers. But these are just 4 of the big patterns that I noticed in pretty much all of their trailers. They're pretty much universal. So let me know down in the comments below what else you'd like to know about creating podcast trailers, editing podcasts, and subscribe for more information about editing podcasts, editing trailers, and marketing your products through video.